I believe that a really good way to understand a culture is through its gardens. This is an extraordinary journey to visit 80 inspiring gardens from all over the world. Some are very well known, like the Taj Mahal or the Alhambra. And I'm also challenging my idea of what a garden actually is. So I'm visiting gardens that float on the Amazon, a strange fantasy in the jungle, as well as the private homes of great designers, and the desert flowering in a garden. And wherever I go, I shall be meeting people that share my own passion for gardens, my epic quest to see the world through 80 of its most fascinating and beautiful gardens. "200 years ago, this was regarded as the most remote and the strangest place on the planet. And I shall be taking a journey across this vast continent, looking at its landscape and above all its gardens, to see how it's evolved from colonization to gradual use and acceptance of the native flora to become the independent modern society that it is today." My journey begins in Sydney, where the British first settled over 200 years ago. I'll then head inland to Alice Springs and a garden in the heart of the continent's vast burning desert, before I turn south to the garden city of Melbourne. Finally, I'll cross the Tasman Sea to New Zealand, to look at gardens filled with their native plants. By the edge of an unremarkable beach on a huge natural bay in the southeast of the country is a very special plant. This is a Banksia, and its strangeness to British eyes and its name acknowledges the beginning of Britain's colonial occupation of this continent. The stone obelisk behind me marks the spot where Cook made his landfall after his epic voyage. And the bay that he stopped in, he called Stingray Bay because he found so many of those fish in these waters. But travelling with Cook was a young botanist called Joseph Banks, who went on to be the first curator of Kew and one of the great figures in botanical history. And Banks found so many new and extraordinary plant species here, around the edge of the bay, that Cook renamed it in his honour, and he called it Botany Bay. The Banksia is only one of the many thousands of spectacular native plants that thrive nowhere else on Earth but here. It was the sheer number of unique species that made the plant's namesake, Joseph Banks, realise that this was more than a new island. This was a whole new continent. They went back home with news of this extraordinary discovery, and 18 years later, the first fleet of settlers and convicts arrived. I'm arriving on the same route today, on the Manly Ferry. When the fleet landed in Botany Bay, where Cook had landed, and then they discovered there was no water, they had to decamp and move. They came up knowing there was an entrance, but they didn't know what they would find. So they came in here, out of the open ocean, hopefully to find a more sheltered place to land. And 200 years later, we know this as Sydney. Unlike those first settlers, my boat docks in a large modern metropolis. But despite the skyscrapers, Sydney's past remains close to hand, and my first Australian garden is slap in the middle of the city. Behind the Opera House are the gates to the Royal Botanic Garden. What I particularly like about this garden is that you have the juxtaposition of this fabulous natural harbour on the one side, and then on the other side, the city right on top of the garden. and its 74 acres are packed with extraordinary plants. But this is not just a botanical reserve. It is in one of the most spectacularly beautiful urban positions in the world, and has always been at the heart of Sydney's life. It is constantly used by Sydney's citizens, either for their rather relentless exercising or just to relax. One of the reasons that I've chosen to visit the Botanic Gardens is not just because it's beautiful and interesting, but because of its importance in the history of the entire occupation of Australia. What the first settlers needed most urgently of all was fresh water. They came up the coast and they found a creek fed by fresh water. And this pond is fed by that same stream. So famously, they created a small farm, 9 acres of wheat. And in fact, the bay out there is still called Farm Cove to this day. The modern Botanic Garden is rich with healthy, lush plants of every variety. But it wasn't always so. In fact, life for the original settlers was almost unimaginably hard. And to clear the farmland, they had to clear wood and forest and scrub. They blunted their axes, they couldn't dig out or get rid of the trunks, so they sowed their corn in amongst them. And this is a recreation of that first crop, which is really hardly a crop at all. We're filming this on the 1st of December, that's the first day of summer, which is pretty much near harvest. This is what they would have had to feed them. Doesn't really look like a crop at all, but their lives depended upon it. And they had to sow into this very, very thin soil. Now, this has had 200 years of improvement, but then it was practically pure sand. But they had little choice, because any convict trying to escape the colony and its struggling crops faced almost certain death by starvation in the dense Australian bush, which was also filled with unfamiliar and sometimes dangerous creatures. The most astonishing thing for me in the Botanic Gardens is not a plant, but the fruit bats. They hang from the branches like sacks, and occasionally extending a vast wing, or the whole tree at times can be fluttering as they move to cool down in the sun. And it's sort of like bellows expanding and contracting. And you can imagine for the first settlers seeing these strange animals, either vast versions of what they saw at home or completely different, must have been an extraordinary thing. As the colony developed, the farmland became the governor's garden, and then in 1816 the Botanic Gardens were officially founded. But that original settlement, by the shelter of Farm Bay, is still at the heart of the garden, and is the symbolic beginning of the modern Australian nation. As Sydney became established, it deliberately recreated the appearance and style of the homeland. These mixed borders at Government House could be part of any British stately home, albeit on the other side of the world. This represents a kind of homesickness, and it's that urge to create a reminder of home that's key to the next wave of Australian gardens, further inland. The first inland town took shape here in Mittagong, in the hills south of Sydney. Mittagong means small mountain and has a much cooler and wetter climate, which was perfect, of course, for those early homesick settlers who started building modest pioneer homes. Initially, all settlement was in Sydney itself. But gradually, people began to leave the city and create lives for themselves in the country. But nevertheless, despite the almost unimaginable hard work it would have involved, there would be time just to plant a little bit of colour, just a token bit of gardening to lift the spirits, if nothing else. And this modest splash of colour to relieve a brutally harsh existence in the countryside heralded a new wave of Australian gardens. By the middle of the 19th century, people in Sydney were becoming wealthy enough to consider moving out of the city during the baking summer months. And they came south here, which is much cooler. Even on a summer's day like today, it's actually positively chilly. And they were buying up the simple little shacks and enlarging them and converting them into summer homes, country houses. And wherever you get a country house, sooner or later, you're going to get a country house garden. The garden at Kennington Green began its life in a modest way in 1860, but since then it has grown to spread over 5 well-tended acres. And it includes a rose garden, a tightly clipped bay tree garden, a silver birchwood, and almost inevitably a potager, all divided as a series of garden rooms centred around the original settler's cottage. Now, the thing that immediately strikes me about Kennington is that here we are, an hour or two south of Sydney, and yet this is a garden that really wouldn't feel out of place in the home counties in England. It's an English country garden. Now, this was a deliberate thing. Apparently, the first settlers, once they'd overcome the sort of hostility of the terrain and got to the luxury of making a garden as opposed to just surviving, sent home for familiar plants. Apparently violets and snowdrops, even songbirds were shipped out so that they could recreate the gardens that they were familiar with. And it was a distinct homesickness, a nostalgia. And they built around them spaces that they could think of as home, not their new homeland, but a distant home that they would probably never see again. And you know, from this point of the garden, I can't see a single native plant. Now, it's worth stressing that Kennington is not a historical recreation. It's a modern garden, but it illustrates so many of the tendencies of those early Australian gardens. And this area, the Bay Garden, shows how that with the tightly clipped bay trees, its conquering nature, it reminds me of the 17th century French and Dutch gardens where you use formality and topiary to show man's mastery of a hostile natural world that lay beyond the garden's edges. Kennington is a series of garden rooms. And as you come out of the Bay Garden, you walk into this wood. And it's made up just of the white trunks of birch and grass. And I think it's the loveliest thing in the entire garden. Kennington is undoubtedly a very beautiful garden, but it's a beautiful fantasy. It's an attempt to create a little piece of England in a very foreign land. And the reality, just the other side of the garden hedge, or at least just down the road, is this. This is the real Australia. It is a completely different world, which the early gardens turned their backs on. But before I leave the Sydney area, I'm going to visit a 21st century garden that celebrates its Australian roots. When I chose this garden, it was really because it was modern, and I'd heard about it, and I'd seen pictures of it. I just thought it looked really interesting. When you walk in here, the first thing you notice are these great jagged angles of rock pushing out at you, and it's almost quite aggressive. But the way that they're balanced actually is not hostile, it's not threatening, and you start to look further and see that the plants work really well with them, with that colour. This tiny, private garden in Sydney's fashionable Mossman district has been created for its owners by the Czech designer Vladimír Sitta. It nestles in the right angle of the building, and with its large sliding glass doors facing onto it, is an important part of the living space. The rock, all 33 tons of it, was quarried in Alice Springs, the red heart of Australia. The owners commissioned the garden to display their collection of drought-resisting succulents. However, not all the plants are Australian, although this magnificent ponytail palm, with its dangling water-storing roots, most certainly is. What is an Australian garden?
Well, I wish to know. The garden is a culture concept to me. And first you have to define what the culture is. I don't think it's even a demand for creating Australian garden. It's not, people think that when they stick Australian plants into some space that that's an Australian garden. That's a load of rubbish.
There's hardly anywhere in the world that relishes being outdoors so much.
Oh, because you have such a good weather.
So you would think that it was the perfect place to make gardens that could be relished all the time.
If you see the garden as a stage set for your hedonistic pursuits, absolutely.
No, but it doesn't have to be a hedonistic pursuit. It doesn't have to be a swimming pool or a tennis court or a barbecue.
But this is what most of our gardens are here, you know, in those richer suburbs, of course. I think the garden ideally should touch you emotionally. And unfortunately, it became, in many ways, just another commodity. In terms of just making your own and creating, then I think we just barely scratched the surface in Australia. Despite Vladimir's Middle European gloom, I think his garden is the closest that I've come so far to feeling a real spirit of Australia. And these jagged angles have a tectonic energy that I like, and which are pointing me to that burning red heart of the continent. So that's where I'm going next, the Outback, near Alice Springs, and it couldn't be less like Sydney. It is a staggeringly harsh, grand, bright orange landscape, but I can see echoes of Sitta's design immediately. And although this vast sand country is classed as desert, it's actually full of life and empty only to the untutored eye. I'm visiting a completely different type of garden, Alice Springs Desert Park, which I hope will help me to understand the Outback a little better. The park opened in 1997. It is designed to introduce people to the plants, animals and Aboriginal culture of the Outback. With spinifex grasses, dried creeks, sand country and even a large salt pan, all painstakingly recreated to mimic the conditions of the Outback in its true setting. It's a vast site with over 100 acres of cultivated garden and over 3,000 acres in all. I was shown round by Gary Dinham, the curator of botany, and he explained to me how the spinifex, the spiky grass that grows in the sand country, is perfectly adapted to the conditions.
It's got these very spiky leaves, which in fact used to be flat leaves, which have rolled around to try and reduce water loss.
I tell you what, that is as beautiful a grass as any in any garden, isn't it?
It's fantastic, yeah, and we're trying to get people to use them more in gardens because it's, you know, it doesn't use much water, it's very easy to manage.
You'll find plants which are less suited to the desert, often growing beside rivers.
So the river red gum are eucalypt?
Eucalyptus camaldulensis.
Right. They're very beautiful with their bark off. I mean, look at this. It's sort of clear white. The desert doesn't really have rivers, or at least if they are, they don't run very often, do they?
No, they're ephemeral rivers. It's the upside-down rivers of Central Australia where the sort of sand's on the top and the water flows underneath, and it's only after the heavy rains that you'll get the river flowing. It was quite interesting with my children as they grew up here in Central Australia. When we actually saw a river with water in it, they were wondering what it was.
Away from the river, either underground or overground, the harsher environment of the red desert sands means that all plants have to be highly adapted.
Yeah, these are only very young desert oaks. They're probably 8 or 10 years old, very, very slow growing plants. Yeah,
It's quite...
You can see that they actually
Yeah.
photosynthesise through the stem, and that little point there is
Yeah.
just the remnant leaf. Under cultivation, that's probably 6 or 7 years old. In the wild, you'd see one of those would probably be 20 years old, but its root system's probably going down 10 metres.
10 metres?
Yeah.
Wow.
So they actually grow a lot more under the ground than
Yeah.
they do above the ground.
Like every bit of this beautifully made garden, the park's artificially created salt pan that's completely natural.
Do you get visitors assuming that this is natural landscape?
Yeah, well, that's one of the greatest compliments to the staff when people think that we're very fortunate to have all these habitats sitting in this small area. So we've sort of fooled them into thinking they're in the natural environment, and the staff really love that. But yeah, that's a great compliment to them.
Oh, you created this place. There's no other word for it. You've made it with your team. Does that make you a gardener?
Well, this is a fantastic garden. It's one of the best gardens you could ever create, I think. And it's recreating the environment is an incredible challenge. It's not that easy, but I think we've managed to get it to do it here, to get it across.
I think you have too.
The Aboriginal population cohabited with and used this flora long, long before Europeans arrived. And I've met up with one of the Desert Park rangers, Doug Taylor, to learn about his people's subtle relationship with the plants of the Australian outback.
This one here is probably one of the most useful plants out in the desert. Common name is the mulga tree.
Yeah.
And so you could obtain food from here, tools.
So the seed would be very small, wouldn't it, on those cones there?
Yes, this one's actually lost all its seed. It would have been seeding a month or two back.
Right.
But it's quite large pods, and this is the seed that it produces. This could be used by our ladies, ground up into like a flour or paste, and then baked into what we call damper or bread.
This tree's timber is perfect for making boomerangs too. This is a non-returning variety.
Boomerang is very good to bring down medium-sized kangaroo. Stop an emu with this.
Really?
One of the strangest of all desert plants is the grass tree, Xanthorrhea, which grows incredibly slowly. So these plants are hundreds of years old.
The land and the people, traditional people, were as one, where our people didn't try to control the land, but lived with it. And everything on the land had its place in our people's culture, and had a right to be there.
It was useful too. The flower spike was used to carry a glowing ember for fire making, which is fitting for a plant that will regrow after being burned. Using fire to manage and regenerate the land was perhaps the closest that Doug's people came to gardening. It involved a highly sophisticated relationship with the land. Each family group had a seasonal cycle of moving from one camp to another within their territory, which they would use as a base for hunting and gathering bush tucker. They would use small controlled burns to flush out game, and once they'd hunted out one campsite, then they would move on to the next.
By the time we returned to this site, the burn done previous, which may be 6 to 8 months later, say, but the burn would have then created regrowth and regeneration. There's an old expression in Australia here, Aborigine go and walkabout, which is basically talking about this type of thing, was what our people used to do. But I like to say Aborigine went on controlled seasonal movement. It sounds a lot better too.
This is the shade of a desert oak, which is a good-sized tree,
Yes.
but not vast, but it is very old.
Oh yeah, very slow growing desert oak. This one's quite mature, the one we're sitting under here, and probably anything up to 400, 500 years.
Really?
Because these trees are so old, generations and generations of people see these trees, and the stories attached to them are like we're looking like the old men and the old women from the past. You sit amongst the desert oaks, the light breeze comes through and it's like a... And if you sit down in the quiet long enough, it sounds like you can hear voices whispering. And that's where a lot of our people believe that the old people are still with these trees and in their spirits are still there.
As I travelled back to Alice Springs, I thought about what Doug had told me. I could see just how perfectly the native people lived in harmony with that seemingly wholly hostile environment. And it was clear that the key factor to this, for plants as well as people, was drought and how to manage it. However, I'm not sure I expect this to be the case in my next destination, which is Melbourne. Melbourne is often referred to as Australia's garden city, and traditionally it has a much wetter climate, thanks to its position on the southern tip of the continent. This was my first visit, and I was surprised to see European plants and trees everywhere, and its leafy green avenues and flower-filled front yards make a dramatic contrast to the parched streets of Alice Springs. And along with the skyscrapers and trams, there still survive quaint, ornate, and now very select Victorian streets. During the 1880s, Melbourne was the second largest city in the British Empire, and many of the opulent homes from that period still survive. And my next garden is the pinnacle of the grand Australian establishment. And my host is Dame Elizabeth Murdoch. Got into Melbourne when it was dark last night, driven to a hotel, went to bed, got up and come out here first thing in the morning. And I have to say, it's a vast culture shock. I could be in another world. Hello, Dame Elizabeth. How nice to meet you.
How are you?
I'm very, very well.
Good. Nice to see you.
And your beautiful garden.
It's looking not bad.
At 99, she and her garden are almost half as old as the nation. She's the matriarch of Australia's great media dynasty and the guiding spirit behind Cruden Farm and its 20-acre garden, which Dame Elizabeth began in the 1920s. And there can be few people on this planet that have gardened continuously in the same place for over 80 years.
Now, it's one of my great prides, my copper beech. I mean, it's fantastic to think I planted that only 52 years ago. And of course, far too close to the house, but never mind, we managed.
Are copper beech fairly unusual?
In Melbourne,
in
yes,
Melbourne.
yes.
Yeah.
When we were planning to put that in, and I said to Michael, my gardener, it's ridiculous, I'll never see this, Michael, really. He said, of course you will, you're going to live forever.
But part of the pleasure of planting a tree is watching it grow, isn't it?
I know, wonderful.
It's not necessarily the finished article. So you've created a landscape that is sort of like Capability Brown in some ways, but you've done it in a lifetime rather than
Yes.
over generations.
Yes, well, I think you see everything grows so fast here.
That's the point. In England, similar trees would take a couple of centuries to grow this big. I love the purple stems, that little purpley touch on the new stems.
Yes, yes, it's lovely, isn't it? Yes, I see you've got a good eye.
This is surreal for me. Here we are looking at hostas,
Yes, I know.
having practically 12 hours ago
Yes.
stepped on a plane in the outback, where the thought of a hosta is
I know. It's, the contrast is fabulous, isn't it? Really amazing.
They look marvellous.
They are beautiful. They're beautiful, the hostas. I love them dearly. That's that's quite a young denudata. It's amazing. It's very protected in there.
Yeah.
And you see the possums eat everything. So we put an electric fence on the roof.
Oh, so they can't come across.
Mind the bump.
Oh, right.
It's rather lovely, isn't it?
It's just beautiful.
Lovely, isn't it?
I've never been in a garden which has reached such maturity within the life of its owner and creator. And I don't think I've ever met a gardener who has quite so much personal charm. I confess that when I walked down the drive here, I thought this is so different from Alice Springs in the outback, that there's no connection. But actually, what this garden has is a sense of place, a sense of self-confidence. So you've got your rose garden and you've got your alchemillas and all the sort of English plants that might seem a bit odd here in Australia. But it also has a real sense of place and identity. It's grounded. At heart, this is a European garden, but one that is very happily married to its native landscape. However, that cross-cultural connection is under serious threat. Climate change is increasing the already serious problem of drought in Australia, and this means that the classic English flowers and lush greenery just won't thrive, and the situation can only get worse. But having seen how the tough Aussie native plants thrive in the outback, I wonder if they are the key to Australia's gardening future. My next garden could answer that question. It's the Garden Vineyard, created by Di Johnson and now extended by her daughter Jenny. The garden is set amongst vineyards in the gently rolling countryside south of Melbourne. It began just 11 years ago, but already it is one of Australia's most exciting gardens because it is a fusion of traditional English design and planting with a contemporary use of native Australian species. It's a story which started out with an attempt to make an exact copy of a very English garden until Di was confronted with the inescapable realities of the climate.
I think that's a perfect example of how one has to adapt, because I love that little geranium. I've tried to grow it here for 3 years. It looks fabulous in winter. And I should give up because look how wonderful the sedum by comparison looks. Just beautiful. We went to a brickyard in North Melbourne, and these are convict bricks, and there's a thumbprint in one of those bricks. Every 1,000 bricks, they had to mark it with a thumbprint. Every 10,000, I think it was, were 2 thumbprints. But these bricks were all handmade by convicts.
And no doubt those convicts were from England.
I'm sure they were.
The next stage of the garden shows the true scale of Di's ambition. The first thing that strikes me, these are socking great borders. You know, I mean, it's
We'll probably
great.
never be able to sell it.
Oh, well, that's another matter.
Nobody wants this much work.
The giant borders mark the very first introduction of Australian natives into Di's garden. Tightly clipped green pillars of the gloriously named lily pilly, which she uses for structure in the border, much as we might use yew at home. The lily pillies came in at what stage?
Well, pretty early on.
Not straight away, but...
No, about the second.
And was that your first venture into sort of indigenous planting?
Yes,
local
absolutely.
planting?
I think the thing is they take the heat as well as the dryness.
Follow the path round the corner, and there is a quantum leap away from the traditional English garden. It's a composition of tightly clipped native shrubs in balls and billows, set around the peeling white trunks of lemon-scented eucalypts. It looks fantastic.
And it's a bit English, but it's got a lot more Australian feel about it. This rhagodia is a brilliant thing. I know this is looking a little drab because we've just had to severely prune it, but it comes back.
Yeah.
But it's totally drought tolerant, and it grows in sun or shade, and we've used it all over the garden.
After that cool modernism, there's a return to a European heritage with a much more formal and rather grand Italianate garden, using clipped coppery lily-pilly lollipops. I've been dying to say that. Underplanted with a sea of agapanthus and heliotropes. Go through a gate and on down a set of steps, and you arrive at the place where everything comes together. This is a dramatic and brave part of the garden, made by Jenny, critically with Di's support, using only native plants.
So this, in a sort of rather simplistic way, is the evolution of the garden and maybe the future of Australian gardening.
Yeah, I think it started off with not too much thought behind it. It started off as a passion of mine.
And a bit of plonking. Oh no, but then...
But plonking is the secret of good gardening.
Yeah. I tried to work with the colour and texture of plants, and I tried to arrange plants in beds that were blended with each other in terms of foliage texture and colour. But I don't think that's that important now. I guess being inspired by the natural bush. I've always loved the natural stands of eucalypts and things that aren't too fiddled with and...
How do you feel about that?
Well, I have realised that Jenny has been a source of great wisdom for me.
I'll be honest with you, when I walked in here and saw the walled English garden, I thought, oh no, this is beautiful, but I didn't need to cross the world to see it. I've seen lots of gardens like that, although not many had done as well as that. But as I walked around, I realised something special was happening here, and that a garden was evolving, not just through the process of the gardener, but through place. And then, really most interesting of all, through time and generations, that as the children of the household grew up and got interested, and they were Australian, and this was their background, and this was their home, they started to evolve a style of gardening that was truly indigenous. It belongs to the place. The result is something genuinely new and beautiful, and most importantly, sustainable in the changing Australian climate. But now it's time to leave Australia and move on for the second phase of my Antipodean adventure. So I travelled 1,200 miles southeast of Australia to New Zealand and land in its biggest city, Auckland.
Well, I popped on a plane and came over here to New Zealand. And although it's just a 3-hour journey and I'm about as far away from home as it's possible to be, it's all instantly familiar. It even smells like England.
But although much seems to be reassuringly similar, there is a spectacular plant growing nearby which reminds me that New Zealand is actually very, very different from home.
For all its instant familiarity, New Zealand is full of very curious things indeed, and this is the Pahutakawa, or the New Zealand Christmas tree, which is just coming into flower now as we approach Christmas.
There is nothing that can prepare you for New Zealand because it's quite unlike anywhere else in the world. Before Westerners came, it was the nearest thing to an earthly paradise, with a very distinctive flora and fauna. This means that gardens here, with a little imagination and resources, can also be unique.
This is Airlie's, and it's the first garden I'm visiting in New Zealand, simply because I've been told it's one of the very best gardens in the whole of the Southern Hemisphere.
Airlie's is a garden with a dreamlike intensity. It's very large, with 12 acres of dense planting and mature trees around the house, surrounded by another 30 acres of planted woodland and fields that run down to the sea. But magnificent as the setting is, it is the planting that overwhelms you. This is a garden that submerses the visitor in plants, so you wallow in their colour, texture, shape and scent. And yet incredibly, I know that only 40 years ago, this was all just a series of grass paddocks.
The effect of the tree ferns and the sound and the general intensity of the planting Makes one think of a sort of lush forest. But actually, just a few yards from here, if you come back, you come through the planting and it just stops. And you realise that we're back to the fields that were grazed by the dairy herd 40 years ago. And although all the trees you can see were planted, the garden is made out of a field. Every little bit of it.
I'm shown round the garden by its creator, Bev McConnell, the celebrated Diane of New Zealand gardening.
I mean, this is quite dramatic here.
Yeah, it is.
It's quite a wow. And I shouldn't be able to grow the Moisei rose, but I do, and I grow that for the hips.
Yeah.
They're absolutely complementary colours, aren't they, the red and the green? Wonderful. And that one, I mean, it's very yellow, but it was born in the garden, so that'll be Ely's gold.
How many plants do you have named after the garden?
Oh, only about 5, I think.
Still 5 more than most people.
Oh, I don't know. Have you not got any yet?
I think there's a...
Oh, look, you're very young.
You're
will come.
very sweet to say
It will
it.
come.
It's
You have to be really old to have plants named after you. You don't mind me interviewing you, do you?
I'm enjoying it.
That's
It's
right.
and you're very good
That's
at it. But you can tell me about your pool, though, because I can't answer your
Oh,
questions
isn't that
about
interesting? Yes.
When did you plant the palms?
Oh, 15 years ago?
Really, as recently as that?
I was just astonished at the planting at Airlie's. It has the widest and most ecstatic range of plants in one garden that I've ever seen. So how did one person create so much in such a short space of time?
And did you come out knowing you wanted to make a garden?
Yes, I did. I had it on paper, the first 3 acres. I married a man who thought big.
Right.
Probably it was a fault that both of us did,
Yes.
but it had its good points too. Otherwise, you'd end up with really nothing. Because a lot of farmers in those days, farmers would say to their wives, if they wanted to build a garden, what do you want to do that for? Just like that. But my husband would say, why not? Let's have a look at it.
So you planted these trees?
Every one. There was nothing here. It was a good dairy farmer's paddock for his stock.
Bev's greatest ally is the climate. There are 365 growing days a year here. The weather is never too cold, never too hot. There is nearly 50 inches of rain a year, and there's much more light. I think that Airlie's is a masterpiece. I've never seen such a wide range of plants together in one garden. But that mixture depends on a lot of exotic and introduced plants as well as natives. And in the light of my Australian experience, I wonder if this best represents the past or the future of New Zealand gardens. To try and answer that, I need to go back in history and on with my journey. I'm going to drive from Airlie's, just outside Auckland, south and west to New Plymouth, a journey which should take me into New Zealand's wild green heart and give me a taste of its original human culture too. But when I make my first stop out in the country to look at the landscape, there's no sign of New Zealand anywhere.
This is a confusing country because the scenery is so like England, with its green grass and buttercups and daisies and trees and cows and all the flowers on the verges of the roads. But you look a bit closer and then there are these oddities, like these marvellous supercharged hydrangeas that we found here. And then you have to realise that everything you're looking at is introduced. This is not the natural flora of the country. Every single element of it is artificial.
And that includes the grass, the trees, the flowers and the shrubs. everything you can see. So, back into the van and on deeper into the hills until finally I find something native. A Maori garden of formulums or New Zealand flax. Whereas I'm familiar with them as UK garden plants, for the Maori, the native people of New Zealand, these plants were a vital source of fibre for clothes and mats. 87-year-old Digger Te Kanawa, a Maori weaver, shows me how they're used.
This is the stripping you have to go through. And you turn it over on the doll side, and about halfway. Now.
So you score it through,
yeah.
but don't cut it through?
No.
Okay.
Now I've got to split them, and this is the tool.
A mussel shell?
A mussel shell. And you get a little bit out like that,
Yeah.
you make a loop like that, then you pull. Yeah.
There it is.
And that's your muka. And you do what you call a mirror. This is a twining.
I see, yeah.
Easy, eh?
No, you make it look very easy. I can see it's hard.
Her flax threads end up as beautiful ceremonial cloaks decorated with feathers, part of Digger's heritage as a Maori, a Polynesian people who settled here more than 600 years ago.
Up there is a photo of the
Yes, she's got
collection.
it on.
That's the whole family?
That's the whole family. Yeah, Mum's made a cloak for each of us.
Can I touch this? Can I just feel it? Because it's very soft, isn't it?
It's not a sort of thing you can make in a month or so, because it's a mood thing. If you don't feel like it, leave it alone.
And are these mats that we're walking on, are these all flax too?
Yes.
Now I think I'm too old to get down on the floor. But I want to teach others.
Yes.
And just on the other side of her land, we touch on Maori's spiritual life, because there's a sacred tree at the end of her drive.
When we were kids, they said it was very tapu and you mustn't go near it and all that sort of thing. And they were scared stiff of it.
Having had a glimpse of some of the native culture, just beyond Digger's home, I get my first sight of New Zealand's native beauty.
Well, things are getting stranger as we go farther away from Auckland, because in amongst the tractors and the long grass and the wonderful flowers are tree ferns. And this is distinctly exotic.
It might look exotic to my English eye, but these plants are indigenous here.
Yeah, turn round. Oh, there's an English meadow. It's just like Alice in Wonderland. That's what it's like. It's a dream world.
Thanks to its mild climate and high rainfall, much of New Zealand was once covered in temperate rainforest, which is a cooler and much gentler sister of the more famous rainforest of the tropics, like the Amazon, but it's every bit as beautiful. As I continue deeper into the mountains, it really feels like I've finally found what I set out to see.
This is primary forest, and almost all of New Zealand would have been covered in this, with these giant podocarps smothered with epiphytes and the tree ferns underneath. And it's very sobering when you drive through and see mile upon mile of landscape, cleared and just with a monoculture of grass, knowing that it was this that had to be removed in order to feed a few sheep and cattle. Just step a few yards into the forest and immediately you're surrounded. And you could be anywhere. And unlike the tropical rainforest, this temperate rainforest is a cool, unthreatening place with this magical green sort of stained glass light filtering through. It's a very benign place.
This is New Zealand's heart, a green, cool, song-filled heaven, spilling over with beautiful plants. Thank goodness a little bit of it was spared and allowed to remain for people like us to treasure. But can this ancient botanical paradise be the inspiration for New Zealand's gardens of the future? I finally reached New Plymouth, ready to visit the last garden of this trip, and rather than turning its back on its natural heritage, this is a garden famous for taking it as its inspiration.
This, slightly surprisingly, in a quiet suburb of New Plymouth, is my journey's end. And I've come here because it's a garden which seems pretty ordinary from the outside, but which I know is comprised entirely of native New Zealand plants.
Te Kanga Mareri, which is Maori for peaceful encampment, is one of New Zealand's very first and best native gardens. It was begun 35 years ago by Valda Paletti and her husband Dave, and although relatively modest in scale, is crammed with plants and features. There's a tree fern alley, a distress mountain shed, an alpine zone, and even a glowworm cave. Rather surprisingly, all created by someone who's very proud of her colonial past.
Your great-grandparents were settlers?
Yeah, they arrived here in 1842 and they sailed from Plymouth Harbour from Somerset. So they, Simon and Jane, set up home, farm. They survived the land wars. You know, great-great-grandmother had stood there with her children behind her, defying the Maori that was threatening to burn her little house down.
That story is a dramatic contrast to this garden, which is clearly in such harmony with its native land.
The Mullumbeckia complexa, the wire netting plant, you could actually jump up and down on that or sleep on it, you know, as a bed.
It's tempting to try.
Yeah, you can do
Fabulous.
that.
I can do it. I will do that.
You can leap, lie down, have a rest.
You see, I'm quite squashy.
Comfortable?
It's very nice. I would sleep on this willingly.
You would, yeah.
And you see, one of the things I like about, if you were in Australia, you would know there would be some noxious spider or snake or something in here.
That's right.
To get you, whereas in New Zealand, you're pretty sure.
Yeah, you're safe as.
Yeah.
You could sleep sweetly and
I have to say, this
soundly.
is the first garden I've ever visited where I've been invited to leap on the plants.
Yeah, leap on the plants. It's Monty-proof.
Now, what's that?
Little
You see?
Kunzia. Now this,
I need my glasses for this,
Right.
which I haven't got on me. They're in my
I'll go
bag.
get a hand lens. Monty Don, I have for you the secret weapon, the hand lens.
Because I can't see without my glasses
No,
anyway.
you're nearly blind. Now this
Yeah.
is gardening beneath your knees.
Can I hold my own lens, please?
You can hold your own
You're
lens.
being
There
bossy.
you go. I'm bossy. I'm a control freak, you know.
Are you? All gardeners are control freaks. All good gardeners
Oh, good.
are complete
He said I'm a good gardener.
Well, you are. Look at that.
Isn't it perfect? This little
Look at
Kunzia
that.
grows up on the central plateau around the fumaroles, around the sulphur vents.
I have never been shown around a garden via a hand lens before.
Really, truly.
So within the space of a minute, I've leapt on your plants and looked in minute detail.
And over here, just by your knees,
Yeah.
don't get up,
Well.
is our lobelia. Again, it's a little darling. It's got like half a flower.
It is lovely. You could spend I could do the whole tour like this.
Yeah,
I
we
could
could just crawl around on our
I could
hands and
crawl
knees, you know,
the
should we
whole
get-
way. I mean, look
Drunk.
at this. Look at this down
Yeah,
here. See, look at that. Look at that. Do you know, I've never done this before.
Yeah.
This is fantastic.
He's converted.
I am, you know.
Good, born again.
I don't normally deal with intense detail.
Oh, don't you? Oh, you wait. There's better to come.
So this is the fernery.
That's right.
And some of these ferns are that must
look
be.
how high this is.
Yeah, that's 30 foot. And you say you planted these in 1972?
Some of them planted in 72.
Well, that is a whopper. And this is the fern house here?
Yep.
You call it the Wharanui?
Yep.
Okay.
Go. And this Monty is a glowworm tunnel.
Do you get glowworms?
We do. We've got about 6.
Right. And it's cool and cold and...
And it's like, you know, sort of dying and emerging and coming out again. into the light.
It's a birthing ceremony.
It is, it's a birthing channel. Didn't want you to clock onto that. So you're born again, and oh look, here's a sign of new life. The para, with his unfurling crozier.
And now your vegetables. See, I'm rather keen on
vegetables. So am I, yeah.
Yeah.
So there we go, vegetables. Pretty organic.
This is a real
This is
culinary...
a working vegetable garden that
Right.
feeds the family.
Yeah.
You know, it's really important.
Now this, to an extent, is what your great-grandparents would have done when they came here, when they would have
Yes,
cleared some soil and
that's
planted
right.
the sort of things that they were used to growing at home.
Yeah, the first things they did was to get a garden established, because without it, the only food they had was the rations off the other boats that came out, like the flour.
Yeah.
And they obviously bought stock and did animal husbandry and raised stock to slaughter. But if the crops failed, then they had trouble surviving in the colonies in those early days.
After the veg garden, it was time to dive down into the Alpines.
I tell you, this is just... Do you know what it's like? It's like snorkeling over a coral reef. That's exactly what it's like.
It is, yeah.
A hidden reef of flower reached through a magnifying glass.
Do you think that the next generation of gardeners will be moving in the direction that you've created?
I do. Younger people are much more open to the flora. They've got over the fact that gardens are flower gardens. And I think there's a greater appreciation and awareness now of the flora within New Zealand and the beauty of the landscapes. You know, I think it's a coming of age for New Zealand.
What a good and hopeful thought that is. And Te Kanga Marere is a visual celebration of New Zealand's future.
So I've reached the end of this particular journey, sitting on the lawn in a smallish garden, in a smallish suburb of a smallish town in New Zealand. And it seemed right and proper to me, having sampled the size and scale of Australia and come down through the North Island of New Zealand, that it should end up on this domestic level, because that's what gardens are. They're about people's back gardens.
But what a journey I've had. From the very first Australian garden and its failing crops in Sydney, to homesick recreations and wonderful flights of fantasy, I've seen a series of amazing gardens in dynamic young countries. But it's the final step that the gardens have made here which I believe holds the key to the future. It's all about working with the land and not fighting it. And that's a simple but powerful message that the indigenous people and plants could have told us all along. Join me next time as I make my first visit to India. As I set off to visit some of the most sensual and opulent gardens in the world.